So, last time we talked about Metis in the context of Metis versus BA and the arete or excellence being found in the middle of the two. This time we're going to take a little bit closer look at BA and the book, the Iliad, which espoused this idea, and the character Achilles, who most strongly embodied this characteristic, which we will look at as a deficiency, and you'll see why very soon. So, Virgil and a lot of other Romans, when they were going back over the Odyssey and translating it into Latin, had a very distasteful view on Metis, this characteristic which they saw as treacherous or not quite fit of a courageous, valorous soldier, which, in the sense of it being an excess of a characteristic, would certainly be true. But BA, likewise, was simply more rewarded by the ethos of the time. The citizen soldier, the aristocrat soldier, they all earned their stripes through combat and through acting in a courageous way, which could be rewarded, and which also helped their city-states and their nations and their homes expand and not be sacked and burned to the ground. The only thing is, as I said before, just because a certain deficiency or excess characteristic look good, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're effective, and it also doesn't mean that they're all that useful in the overall strategic purposes which you need to achieve some sort of end or goal. So let's look at that a little bit closer. Last time when I talked about Metis, we said that it was being more concerned with the ends over the means, and this time with BA, it's going to be basically the exact opposite. They held that the means were equal to the ends. This means that they thought that dying with valor, or dying on the battlefield having attempted to act in the proper way, was better than winning through some sort of trick or stratagem and achieved them more fame or glory. Not everyone thought like this, especially not once you get to the truly successful generals, but a lot of them didn't actually. Julius Caesar, Sulla, Scipio Africanus, none of these men really went full Metis either. They more strove for the arete, for the excellence between the two. So, BA, what exactly does it mean, and why is it a negative overall characteristic when attempting to achieve an end? So, just real quickly, let's go back over the Iliad and what had happened up to the point of the defeat of the Trojans. There was a great coalition of the Greek city-states and armies, led by the Greek king Agamemnon as well as a few others, who sailed across the Aegean to Troy to make battle. Now, the pretext seems very flimsy that they all went over there to fight this over-decade-long war simply for one guy's girlfriend, but I would argue that they were more going there to attempt to achieve this characteristic of BA. They went over Achilles, Agamemnon, Ajax, countless other soldiers, fought over and over again, spilling the sands in front of the great city of Troy, full of blood. And the Iliad, up to near the end of the book, is full of stories of heroism, of courage, of valor, of warfare and battle. But there's one thing that it doesn't have until the very end, and that is victory. It almost seems as if to a lot of these people, victory was sort of an afterthought. They didn't really care about winning, they cared about showing themselves as stout warriors as battlemen, as battle-tested and hardened. They wanted to espouse the characteristic of BA. They knew that the means in their ends to the war were just as important, if not more important, to their countrymen and to their posterity. This sort of begs the question as to whether or not most of them actually even cared to win the war in the beginning. So, Achilles. He was a very interesting character. He was the hero, you could say, of the Greeks. He fought and slew many men, but there was also several times where he was very quarrelsome with his own side, being so mad at Agamemnon that he retired from the battlefield and almost allowed the Greeks to get wiped out until his good friend, who was pretending to be Achilles, had been killed by Hector. Hector was the hero of the Trojans. Probably already know that, just thought I'd throw it out there. And upon hearing this, Achilles decided that it was time for him to stand up. Here's the thing though, Achilles was the embodiment of BA, of strength, of courage, of valor. So when he went to fight the Trojan hero, Hector, he wasn't actually interested in ending the war. And, very interestingly, the hero of the Iliad would die a good amount of time before the siege of Troy was successful. So it sort of leaves the question, if he didn't actually have a hand in the victory of the Trojan War, then how could he be considered the hero? And this is because of the concept of BA in the ancient Greek times. He wasn't the hero because he captured the city. He wasn't even necessarily the hero because he had slain the most men. He was the hero because he was valorous, he was strong, and he stood in his place to the end. And one more time, we're going to compare BA and Metis, so that we can look at the difference in Achilles and Odysseus. So, the hero of the Iliad, Achilles, fought hard. He espoused this idea of BA, of strength and of courage, yet he was not as significant of a factor to the overall conquest of Troy, except maybe in a moral sense, you could say, as Odysseus. And yet Odysseus would not be talked much about until the Odyssey, which comes much after the Iliad. So, on the one hand, with Achilles, we have the means being as important or even more important to the end being the end of the Trojan War. Achilles never really showed too much interest in ending the war. He showed more interest in showing his martial prowess and in displaying the valorous qualities that were seen as good and noble at the time. But this meant that he could never achieve the strategic aim that he and his compatriots were looking towards. Odysseus, on the other hand, was full-blown Metis. He did not care about the war, he did not care about looking like a warrior or a fine soldier. He wanted to achieve his strategic goals above everything else. So, when we look at both of these, we'll notice that Achilles did fail to achieve his end goal, but he did succeed in appropriating the means to that goal and becoming the hero of the story. Odysseus failed at being the hero of the story, and yet he was the driving factor that led to the victory over the Trojans. This shows the arete, the striving for excellence in the center, and how these two great polar men in this battle needed to both give their sides in order for the excellence of victory to be in the middle, achievable for the Greeks overall. They would both suffer greatly for their deficiencies and for their excesses, and there was no one character in all of the Iliad or Odyssey which really espoused this driving towards excellence, the techne, the refining of their skill until they accomplished that excellent goal. This is probably because the concept of arete came from Aristotle, and Aristotle was formulating these ideas from works like the Iliad and the Odyssey long after they had already happened. So, a strategic idea and a strategic goal, the striving for the balance of the means over the ends and the ends over the means, to become not only a strategic thinker and a cunning man, but also a wise warrior and valorous in their own right. So, now that we have our basic foundation of the Greek arete or excellence, their concepts of Metis, meaning strategic intellect, and Ba, meaning soldierly valor or courage, we're also going to throw in the elements of natural strategy that we looked at previously, coalitions, deception, and violence, and look at one of the greatest times of warfare, expansion, cunning, and just overall very interesting time, the Hellenistic period following the death of Alexander. So Alexander the Great was certainly a fantastic figure. He did a lot that very few people would ever be able to come close to in the future with limited means and to such an alarming degree, but that's not exactly what we want to look at quite yet. We'll probably end up looking at him eventually, but I'm much more interested in applying these topics to what's called the Wars of the Diadochi. So we're going to look at the first couple, the major players, and how they came to form what would become the Hellenistic world. So first, let's talk a little bit about Alexander the Great and his father, Philip the Great. So Philip was the king of Macedon. He ended up spreading his influence far to the south and taking over just about all of the Greek peninsula and the upper Macedon and Thrace area. We're going to have a lot of maps for these next couple of parts, so if you enjoy that sort of thing, enjoy. Then Philip had a very interesting strategy, which would actually be used quite frequently by several other conquerors and great people, such as Genghis Khan. His main strategy was to bring up lots of aristocrat soldiers, nobles who would also be warriors, and to enrich them through his own conquests. He wasn't quite as interested in making himself an emperor or a godlike figure as he was in having stability and being able to pass off his legacy to his son. He didn't actually conquer much of the Greek city-states that we think of from this time today, Athens, Sparta, places like that. He more just asked them for support and allowed them a high degree of autonomy, which was another one of his master strokes in combining all of these disparate areas in a time when communication lines certainly would have been very difficult. Alexander took this a step further, and one of his main strengths was his ability to take ideas that weren't his, that weren't from his culture or his people, and turn them into workable constructs for his army and for his empire. A couple of these important ideas were satrapies and satraps and chiliarchs, so governance and military organization. The satrapies were sort of like provinces in Roman times. They were areas which were governed by individual satraps, and a satrap was essentially a governor. So every time he carved out a new satrapy, he needed a new satrap, a new governor. This would be one of his lieutenants, one of his soldiers, someone who had showed themselves deserving of reward, and it generally came with a pretty high salary. A little look real quick at the military organization. The Romans were the first to really come up with low-level officers and ideas like that. It was still pretty disorganized in Alexander's time, although he did the best that he could to add as much organization as possible. He made several of his best men generals, masters of the horse, and then he would have one, which was originally Hephaestion and later Perdiccas, named the Chiliarch. Chiliarch originally meant 1,000 men, the commander of 1,000 men, but it would come in Alexander's time to mean more the master of the army, his second in command. So he had a second in command, and he had generals, but there wasn't really a command structure. He worked very hard to make sure that all of his best lieutenants and generals were all regarded as equals, and the only above any of them would be Alexander. Now, Alexander had a brother, Aridaeus, and he had a newborn son on the way, who would be Alexander IV. They were the closest thing to successors directly to Alexander that existed, and yet Aridaeus was seen as not mentally all there or functional, and the young Alexander IV, from his wife Roxanne, would not be born for some months. So he had a pretty heavy night of drinking after his conquests were finished in Babylon, fell sick, and ended up dying, surrounded by all of his commanders. When he died, he uttered the words, "To the best." Now, what this meant exactly has been very hotly debated all through history, and it was very hotly debated at the time among his generals. The Diadochi, which I referred to earlier, are the successors of this great man, Alexander. Some of them wanted Arius to become the regent because that meant that the empire would be very easily usurped and controlled by outside forces. Perdiccas himself, the old commander of commanders under Alexander, wanted the young Alexander IV to become king once he was born, which would leave Perdiccas as regent and therefore effectively emperor. And then still others thought that the empire was too large, and without a figure like Alexander or the previous Philip the Great, there would be no way to hold it all together, and the best way to go would be a disassembly or a breaking up into parts. These ideas would come into conflict, and the main leaders, Ptolemy, Perdiccas, Antigonus, Seleucus, and Cassander, would all come to the forefront to try to carve up their own parts of the empire. Whether through unity or through dissolution, a decision had to be made that would deeply affect the Hellenistic world for all of its history. It's very important to note that Alexander's attributions and conquests were very great, but all in the end that he really did was determine the scope of where the Hellenistic world would be and what it would influence. The Diadochi, his successors, would actually determine the characteristics and the history therein of the Hellenistic world. So, at the death of Alexander, there was effectively three main parts of the empire, which were taken by various individuals. There was Asia, which was about half of Anatolia, Syria, Palestine, all the way through Persia, all the way up to Sogdiana, and places in the Far East Bactria. There was Europe, which was the northern half of Anatolia, and obviously the European Balkans. And there was Egypt, which was very hard to invade, had a lot of its own resources, and had been independent for some time. These three parts, Europe, Asia, and Egypt, would eventually become the three major staging grounds of the Wars of the Diadochi. And that's it for now. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed, I hope that you leave a like, or if there's something that you didn't understand, you want to see more of, any sort of input whatsoever, feel free to leave a comment or respond to just about all of them. If you want to see more content like this, make sure to subscribe so that you can see all the latest videos. And this is going to be a little bit longer of a set. It'll probably be about 3 episodes. So if you enjoy this, let me know. If there's anything else you want to see, let me know. But until next time, remember, Ave Imperator.